considered that an interim deal, not making the final deal more achievable. We'll discuss that today. And obviously what's going on in Iraq and how that might impact Iran and the negotiations in Vienna will also be discussed. So we have 4 members of our task force, including both our co-chairs, Ambassador Eric Edelman, co-chairs our Iran task force on my right, former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy under the President George W. Bush, and a former ambassador to Turkey. He's currently a distinguished fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, as well as the Roger Hertog Distinguished Practitioner in Residence at the Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies at SAIS. Which I always think, Eric, you must have the longest business card of anyone.
I just got a lot of them.
He's got a lot of them, okay. Further to his right, Ambassador Dennis Ross is other co-chair of our Iran task force, former special assistant to President Obama, and National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region. He's currently a distinguished fellow and counselor at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. To his right is Ray Takeyh, another member of our task force. He's currently a senior fellow at the Middle East Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations. He's a former senior advisor on Iran at the State Department and author of multiple books and obviously articles as well on Iran. And then finally, John Hanna is also a member of our Iran task force and a senior advisor to our Gemunder Center for Defense and Strategy. John is former assistant for national security affairs to Vice President Cheney. He's currently a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Okay, let's start. Eric, how do you think where are we heading with diplomacy? Do you think we'll have a deal by July 20th? And how do you see, if at all, the impact of the fighting in Iraq on these talks?
Well, I think that it's a little bit difficult to say with any precision what is going to transpire. The negotiators, at least on the U.S. side, have been very circumspect about what they've said about the last couple of rounds. Clearly, the last round was much more difficult than had been anticipated. The Iranians, who I think the U.S. side had hoped would come prepared, just down in drafting language on some of the key contentious issues, proved not to be willing to do so. It seems, at least now, that there's at least a willingness to try and see if there's a way to close the gaps that exist. But it's really hard to say whether a deal will be reached by the 20th or not. I think the way to think about it, and to raise the question of Iraq, which I think is appropriate, is to try and get a sense of where the leverage is for each side and how they see it. And I do think that judging, there are others on the panel who are more expert on the internal situation in Iran than I am, but my sense is, from reading what the Iranian leadership has been saying, they seem to feel under less compulsion to reach a deal now than they did a few months ago. There are many reasons for that, perhaps, we can go into, but I think it makes it, in my view, less likely that a deal will be reached on July 20th. It is possible that the circumstances in Iraq could have some impact on all of this, but it's not clear to me that it will. And again, I think we can go through some of the reasons why it might, and again, why it might not. To my way of thinking, although there is a superficial confluence of interest that the United States and Iran have, we still are separated by very deep differences about how we see the future of Iraq. And I think, at least from someone who was involved when Iran was quite active while we had troops on the ground, I don't think we should forget that they spent a lot of time trying to kill U.S. forces in Iraq. In the period of time from 2003 to 2011.
Dennis?
Well, I basically agree with what Eric had to say. I don't think the prospects for a deal by July 20th are that great. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but I think the key to whether or not there's going to be a deal depends upon whether or not Iran is prepared to adjust its behavior. This is a deal that, if there's going to be one, is about rolling back sanctions from the Iranian standpoint in return for, from our standpoint, them rolling back their program, their nuclear program. From our standpoint, they have to roll back their nuclear program dramatically. And everything that they are conveying, if you look at the op-ed in the Washington Post that their foreign minister wrote, the message was, look back in 2003, 2004, when we only had 200 centrifuges, we offered a deal, you didn't take it, now we have 20,000. Now we're, Iraq and waterfront's only a year away. The implication was, if you had taken the deal we were offering you at that time, things would be different today, and we can't roll the clock back. We have all these advances, we've invested all this, we've paid a serious price. We're still offering you what is a reasonable approach, but the reasonable approach basically amounts to us being offering some transparency, but not rolling back the program. Well, if their position is going to remain that way, then there's not going to be a deal. The question is that something that they believe genuinely, or is that a posture? Is it a posture because they're trying to convince us that they're not going to roll back, or at the last minute they'll offer some concessions and make it appear that that's a much bigger deal than it actually is? That's very possible. The real question is their real attitude one that's being revealed in public, or is this a kind of posture for negotiation? It wouldn't be the first time someone postures in public for negotiations and they actually have something different that they're prepared to do when you reach a certain crunch point. Another possible explanation could be those who are negotiating are proving from the Iranian standpoint that they're prepared to hold a very tough line and then go back and say, look, we're going to get the kind of relief and sanctions we want, we will have to make further adjustments. So a lot of this, I think, is an unknown, and anybody who thinks they know the answer at this point, I think is probably kidding themselves. This is something we'll have to see. I think everything we're seeing from the administration at this point is that they seem to have a clear understanding of what they're prepared to do and not do. They continue to say that no deal is better than a bad deal. That's a signal that they're in that they don't feel desperate for a deal, which I think is an important posture to have. I would say also in answer to the impact of Iraq, this is not a case where we need the Iranians more than they need us. Yes, we don't want to see ISIS establish a real strong foothold in Iraq. But that's bad for the Iranians. It's a whole lot closer to them than it is to us. Just because there's a convergence of interest doesn't mean that somehow we would owe them something or we need something. I would reinforce the point that Eric made. The Al-Quds forces and the Takeyh Hezbollah and Al-Haq, the Shiite militias that the Revolutionary Guard train, fund, and arm are responsible for a very large number of American deaths in Iraq. The idea that suddenly these would become our partners, I think, makes very little sense. That we have a converging interest in terms of trying to ensure that ISIS doesn't establish itself, yes, that's true. But I would tend to focus more on the countries with whom we have more in common, who also have that same interest. Jordan has a very strong interest in ensuring that isn't the case, and we have a very strong interest from the Jordanian standpoint. Turkey has a similar interest. The Saudis have a similar interest. There's a lot of countries in the region that don't want to see ISIS establish itself that way. And I don't think we should forget, one of the reasons that we have this problem today is that the Iranians have done an awful lot to ensure that the kind of inclusiveness that might have made Iraq much more of a growing concern wasn't possible. And so in many respects right now, the Iranians are reaping what they've sown. So I can see the value of us deconflicting with them. That's very different from us suddenly looking like we're going to collaborate with them. I think that would be a mistake, and certainly we should not feel that anything that they might do that also reflects what we see as being of some value to us in Iraq is a reason for us to concede anything on the nuclear issue. We have consistently said that we're focused on the nuclear issue and not connecting it to the other issue. Well, if that's the posture of the administration, then obviously what's going on in Iraq now should not in any way lead to any kinds of additional consideration for the Iranians on the nuclear issue.
Ray, and I know I'll come back about the Iran internals a bit more, but you can just give your broad view on this issue.
Is this working? I'll just say a few things to echo what has been said. I think if you kind of look at why Joint Plan of Action arrived and was transacted in November, there was a lot of discussion about the importance of sanctions in moving Iran in the right direction. And I'm not trying to minimize the importance and effectiveness of the sanctions regime that has been created over the past decade or so. But in September or so, the Supreme Leader laid out his red lines for a nuclear agreement. And he had three prohibitions. Number one, that no facility would close, no nuclear material would be shipped out, and there would be no suspension. And if you look at Joint Plan of Action, it actually conformed to those red lines. And this is what the Jadidi people are saying, that the agreement essentially conforms to the red lines that they went with. I think in absence of that, perhaps Joint Plan of Action would not have come about, irrespective of the importance of the sanctions regime and the effect that it has had on the Iranian economy. If you kind of look at what Iranian negotiator Mr. Aralchi says, he's much more optimistic about the direction of the talks. What he says most recently yesterday in a fairly expansive interview, that there are only two issues that are remain. One, the enrichment activities as was suggested, and second is the pace of sanctions relief. I think he seemed to suggest that the two sides have a schedule of sanctions relief, but there's a difference about the pace. And here, there's some degree of disunity in the United States, more so than Iraq. He seemed to hint that the fact that the executive and legislature are at odds in the United States helps them. Because in his interview, he said, look, Americans need agreement by July 16th because the pressure, the congressional pressure that they will get. And so, that's the pressure that they're under. So the poor relations between executive and legislature are sort of playing themselves out in the Iranian mind as a point of leverage for them into these negotiations. That may be wrong, but I think a better management of congressional relations by the White House would have been more advisable for a wide variety of reasons. On whether there'll be an agreement on July 20th, I think it's possible. I don't think you can judge these agreements or prospects of an agreement by this ebbs and flows in June. I think you have to figure out what happens on 11:59 on July 20th. If there's no agreement there at that time, then as we were talking about yesterday, I don't think there'll be an agreement. Then you're in what I call the Arab-Israeli loop. Then you're in an Arab-Israeli process, where there's process without real prospect of an agreement. Because by July 20th, Iranians know what they have to do. They just don't want to do it. And if they don't want to do it on July 20th, they're not going to do it on August 3rd, October 4th. I'm not suggesting that the process will not go on or that it should not go on. But I think that process is more likely than not to be an inconclusive one. Because these negotiations have been intense, substantive, around the clock. The points of views of both parties have been expressed. So Iranians know what they have to do. And if they're unwilling to undertake those obligations by July 20th, then they have made an assessment that the cost of undertaking those obligations outweighs the cost of not doing so. And I think if these particular, I do think that negotiations would go on. And I do think this particular Iranian government is in better position to actually have a public relations success should they break down. Because the international community, I think 5+1, to some extent the United States, certainly the online movement and others, have an investment in the success of the Rouhani administration. And the Rouhani administration has managed to present itself as a barrier to emergence of reactionary forces within Iran. So therefore, there'll be less more hesitancy, I think, by international community opportunity to kind of mobilize against the Rouhani government, given its centrality in preserving a more moderate, pragmatic regime within Iran. But as I said, I can't say it'll be a July 20th agreement. If you listen to Abbas Araghchi, you think there would be. That's how he speaks, but remains to be seen. On Iraq, just briefly, I don't have anything to add. I think the overall objectives of the United States and Iran don't come together in Iraq. Iranians want a sectarian Shia Iran that they can dominate and exclude from the Sunni councils of power. And the United States ostensibly wants an inclusive Iraq. So the overall objectives don't come together. I think I agree that there's some convergence of interest on the tactical issue of this particular Sunni insurgency. I'm not quite sure how that tactical convergence can be expressed in a cooperative manner, given the fact that all the problems that exist in the United States and Iran. I think the Iranian negotiating team probably thinks that Iraq gives them a leverage in negotiations. They may be, as Dennis suggests, quite wrong about that. But, you know, miscommunication is also part of negotiations anyway. Thanks. Yeah.
I mean, lots been said. I agree with most of it. I'm also, I guess, skeptical at this point in time that we'll have a deal by July 20th, although I do worry, as Dennis hinted, that what in fact may be happening here is that we're all being conditioned that when a deal comes and Iran has agreed to some degree of rollback in its program, that it will be treated by a lot of people as a significant achievement and victory, when in fact it's really not, and does leave Iran as a threshold nuclear state within a matter, whatever the calculations are, 6 months of a breakout, perhaps even less, although the administration and others suggest we're not going for anything less than that. But we've been conditioned now to basically cross all of the red lines that we and anybody who looked at the Iranian problem has had, the United Nations Security Council has had in 6 compulsory resolutions that are not going to be obeyed regarding the questions of suspension and no enrichment and no storage of low-enriched uranium and no functioning of the Fordow facility, manufacture of centrifuges, R&D programs. I think everybody now, the people who have conditioned us to believe that those are all non-starters, have in fact won that day, and now we're operating on an Iranian playing field. We're operating on Iranian red lines. How far can we push those questions? How low can we get the number of centrifuges? How little LEU, 5%, can they have stored inside the country? What do we do with Iraq? We're not going to shut it down, but what kind of fig leaf can we put on it that the Iranians could accept? Same thing with Fordow. So I do worry about, and this seems to me it's a perpetual problem in any kind of arms control agreement with a relatively hostile, anti-American, authoritarian state that become very invested in these negotiations. And it just seems to me that the red lines of the guys on the other side of the table always tend to eventually trump the red lines on our side, because we want to be reasonable, we want to go the extra mile. I do worry about that. I hope it's not the case. With respect to the Iraqi problem, I think it's a very serious problem. Certainly for us, for Iran as well, I agree with Dennis. On the other hand, Syria has been a problem for Iran as well, and yet they have done what they needed to do to position themselves quite well and looking like victors in Syria, despite the fact that all you've got now is a rump state in Damascus and along the coast, along Hezbollah land in Lebanon. I'd say people would think, looking back over the last 3 years, the Iranians have done pretty well as patrons of anti-American forces in the region, and at thwarting an American policy, which has explicitly been the removal of Bashar al-Assad for the last 3 years. They replicate that in Iraq. If they then become the dominant protectors of all the Shiite holy sites, they gain control over the Marja'i in Iraq, if they're the guys who are basically calling the shots in a rum state, a Shiite state in Baghdad, and have additional leverage over 3.5 million barrels of oil that the Iraqis are pumping out every day, if they become the arbiters of what happens to those oil fields, even if we have an ISIS state. Seems to me that's not a good outcome for the United States, and we ought to be thinking very hard how we avoid that, how we both fight ISIS and we fight the Iranian plan to increase its own power and influence over the Shia regions of Iraq. I would also say that it seems to me that any prospective nuclear deal is just getting harder and harder. It will be a harder and harder sell to our regional allies in this environment as the wheels are coming off in the Middle East. Our worst enemies, Al-Qaeda, are stronger probably than they've been at any time since September 11, 2001. They are consolidating territory in the heart of the Middle East. Key regions, including key partners of the United States. They are taking territory. They are developing an efficient, mechanized, conventional type of army. They are gaining access to economic assets that bin Laden could only have dreamed of having under his control. Not to mention what's going on in other parts of the region, whether it's on the Israeli-Palestinian front and Hamas's entry into a Palestinian government, tensions in the U.S. relations with Egypt. It seems to me that all of this to drop a compromise deal with the Iranians on the nuclear front into that kind of environment where people are so highly suspicious and worried about American retrenchment and what's going to be the nature of the American-Iranian relationship and what are the Americans going to be willing to allow the Iranians to get away with, that it's going to have to be a pretty damn tough deal, it seems to me, in order to cross the threshold of people like the Saudis and people like the Israelis, for whom I would imagine 6 to 12 months of breakout time from an American intelligence community that didn't actually realize that ISIS was about to take Iraq's second largest city, and that the Iraqi military, which we had armed and trained over the course of almost a decade, was going to fold like a cheap suit. They didn't know that. And Israel, within a few minutes flying time of ballistic missiles from Iran, is going to trust them to identify and then respond effectively to a breakout time of 6 to 12 months. I think it's got to be a pretty good deal in order to cross that threshold for the Israelis and for other friends of ours in the region.
Let me, Dennis, I'd like to actually just pick up on John's last point about the allies and then what's happening in Iraq makes it even, and the region, makes it even harder sell a nuclear deal for our allies.
Well, I take John's point very seriously, but I would conceptualize it a little bit differently. I do think that the Israelis and our key Arab friends look at the nature of the problem through a different lens. The Israelis, if there was a nuclear deal that was a good deal, it removes what is an existential threat. For the Saudis and others, the existential threat is what the Iranians are doing on the ground. The nuclear issue, the nuclear program is an instrument of Iran's pursuit of regional hegemony. So, in a paradoxical way, the Saudis and others are bound to be more suspicious of any deal with the Iranians because they're going to see it as somehow this is part and parcel of us being more prepared to, in a sense, turn a blind eye to Iranian activities on the ground. And you could address that by showing an increasing American readiness to compete with the Iranians in the region. So I say, if the U.S. was now in a very very systematic way, prepared to intercept Iranian clandestine arms shipments around the region, that would signal that we're prepared not to allow the Iranians to change the balance of power on the ground. That would be something that would, I think, matter a great deal to the Saudis and others. The Israelis will judge a nuclear deal on whether it's leaving Iran in a position that they think allows it to be a threshold state. And the less, the more time that is bought, the better that deal could be. Even here, there are things the U.S. could do with Israel that would also signal our readiness to adopt a kind of posture that would be reassuring to the Israelis. The character of the deal is one thing, but for example, if we had a set of understandings with the Israelis on what would be done in the event of certain kinds of violations of the deal by the Iranians, including not just the use of sanctions, but even the use of force in response, or an American understanding and support for Israeli actions in response to that. That could be a way to address some of the Israeli concerns. I've talked about being prepared to enhance Israeli capabilities to act militarily. You wrote an article at one point that talked about being prepared to lease some B-52s to the Israelis in the context of a deal where we have a set of understandings with the Israelis on the consequences of different kinds of violations in advance, and we have certain understandings of what we would do or what we would accept the Israelis doing. I think you can affect the Israeli attitude. So my point is, with regional actors, whether it's the case of the Saudis and others, there are certain things that we could do that would address broader concerns they have. With the Israelis, there are certain things, depending upon the character of the deal and things we do with them in light of the deal, you could also address some of their concerns as well.
Let me, Eric, before I ask Eric, I want to follow one thing, but Dennis, just one thing that you said, and I want to ask Eric to comment. You mentioned about augmenting Israel's capacity to strike and referred, so, and you're right, General David Tula and I wrote an op-ed a couple months ago about giving Israel spare B-52s and selling them the MOPS, 30,000-pound bunker bus. If that's something you think would be helpful to instruct?
I think, yes, I think you need to, there's sort of three different elements here. One is the character of the deal, and we can talk more about that. Two is having a systematic discussion on, in the event of the deal, consequences of cheating. Now, not every violation is equal, but talking through and thinking through the range of different kinds of violations and what the appropriate responses to those would be, and having certain understandings about that in advance, I think would be quite reassuring to them. And I also think it gets at the, there's a certain paradox for me. I think the prospect of a deal with the Iranians goes up, the more the Iranians come to believe that the failure of diplomacy costs them much more than it costs us.
Sorry, Eric.
Well, I think Dennis made some very important and I think salutary points, both about our willingness to compete in this region with Iran over the long run, which I think is extremely important, as well as being positioned to deal with violations of the agreement should an agreement actually eventuate. I think all of that is going to be very important if we actually get to an agreement. But I did want to come back to John's point about the deteriorating situation in Iraq creating a more difficult regional context. I was before the unraveling began, I was in Abu Dhabi and Dubai talking to some of our friends in the Emirates, which is one of our both veteran and more forward-looking partners in the region. And there is a special sensitivity to a potential agreement because they signed a 1-2-3 agreement with us on nuclear power that signed them up to the so-called gold standard of protection of the non-proliferation regime, foregoing any option to enrich. They recognize that in the JPA that has already been breached, and that an agreement, if we get one, will provide Iran with some level of enrichment capability. And I think the difficulty now is that with all the things that Dennis described and that Ray described about the red lines that the Iranian leadership has held out about its unwillingness to roll back the program, the higher we end up having to go in terms of the number of centrifuges, the worse the deal is going to look to our friends and partners in the region, particularly those who are in that position.
Eric, if I could ask you a follow-up question. Some believe, and that in light of Bergdahl, but in other things, you see this, people say, well, the administration had a, Brett Stevens wrote a piece about all the, yesterday, Wall Street Journal, about all their, the problems that have been going on in the world and the lack of success of the Obama team. And that this administration is extremely keen about what they would portray as a foreign policy success, and that they're too eager for a deal. And I'm just curious what you think about that.
Well, I agree with Dennis. I mean, I think if you look at what our negotiators have been saying and what Secretary Kerry has been saying repeatedly, they have said that a bad deal is worse than no deal, and I'm inclined to take them, at their word, and then judge the deal if it eventuates, on the basis of whether they lived up to that standard or not. And there's certainly no shortage of people giving advice, not just us on our panel, but David Albright had, I think, a very useful piece that he and Ollie Hannon wrote, which suggested some compromises that it would be best for the administration to avoid. I thought that was a particularly good piece, and I would hope that folks in the administration are paying attention to that.
You, I'm going to go back to Dennis, and I want to get to Ray. But Dennis, what constraints do you think the administration is working with for a deal? If Congress, public opinion, several of you here, I think the three of you, Ray and Dennis, and you and Eric wrote a piece about how we have congressional buy-off. I was just curious, what constraints do you think the administration is feeling right now in their approach to the deal, domestic issues?
Well, I think they're certainly mindful of what the attitudes on the Hill are. I think the reason we wrote the piece is partly because we think it's more likely for any agreement to be sustainable if, in fact, you have congressional buy-in. But also, it actually gets to the point that Ray was making earlier. I think it helps produce a deal if the Iranians understand that it really reflects a kind of united American position. It shows a deeper character of resolve. And let's take it one step further. I don't want to be in a position where we get a deal and then the Iranians are in a position to say, well, you didn't live up to it because you weren't able to implement it, and therefore we don't have to. And having the congressional side of this is an important element of ensuring if you get a deal that you can actually implement the deal. And I think the administration has just as much of a stake in ensuring that if they get a deal, they can implement it as anyone. So I am mindful of talking to people in the administration that they do seem to be spending more time having people go to the Hill and explain exactly what they're doing. And part of the reason that we wrote that piece was to encourage more outreach to the Congress. It's a two-way street. If the administration reaches out to the Congress, then Congress also has to be responsible in return. And that was also the thrust of what we were writing.
Let me, Ray, and we kind of, but I wanted to ask you about the Iranian side a little more. You mentioned, I think it was you were saying it, I think you said that the Iranians feel less compelled in recent months to come to a deal. And I just want to mention some energy oil export data. Since November, when this deal, the interim deal was essentially concluded but not officially signed, well, let me say, in October, the Iranians exported, I think, a little over 800,000 barrels a day. Beginning November through May, they've averaged 1.3 million barrels a day, with May initial reports, we don't have conclusive numbers for May exports, but it seems like they reach all the way to 1.5 million barrels a day. Administration had talked about, they understood that the JPA talked about 1 million barrels a day. So clearly, they're getting in a lot more money. And we estimate, Jonathan and Rui in my group has estimated that because of the JPA, they'll earn $14 billion more than they otherwise would have in oil exports because of this deal. I was just curious what you think, how that, if anything, is impacting the Iranian approach here, or what?
Can I just say one thing about congressional relations? And I'll be brief. Dennis and I were talking about this yesterday. In my view, if the negotiations go past July 20th, then I think if I were in the White House, I would begin negotiating with Kirk Menendez about what kind of a sanctions bill do I want, what provisions, and as you said, there's some provisions that the White House can't live with, and I would force trade with them. And I would actually have Kirk Menendez come to the floor around September, October in a bipartisan way with executive and legislative support. This, I think, to be implemented, to be voted on, but implemented in January 15th. This way, you go back to the Iranians and you say, we're united in the United States, the executive branch and legislative branch are together, we have a bipartisan approach, and there's this thing hanging on you that will automatically trigger into effect on January 15th. But I would have them vote in September, October, and you can spend the July and August between executive branch and Kirk Menendez, and what kind of a deal you want, because there are some provisions of Kirk Menendez that the White House doesn't want to live with, and there's some things that Kirk and Menendez want that the White House has to agree. As Dennis said, it has to be a compromise legislation. Both sides cannot achieve their maximum objectives. As to the Iranian side, I think there are kind of two competing visions about the future. One is the Supreme Leader vision, which is based upon the notions of economy of resistance and politics of defiance. So in that sense, the economic indicators are important, but not enormously consequential in the way he kind of thinks about these issues. And the importance of nuclear advances and all the suspicions and conspiracies that he relies on to explain things. I do think that the Rouhani administration has more of a stake in having a greater degree of economic vitality, because that's the basis of its appeal to the public. Namely, that we're going to try to resolve the nuclear issue in a manner that preserves our nuclear infrastructure, but also revives the economy. So I think there's some degree of tensions within Iran. I also think, I think Dennis mentioned it, or Eric, as these negotiations move forward, the Iranians are in a far worse position than we are. Because Hassan Rouhani has ginned up 75 million people, saying to them, sanctions are going to go, economic recovery is going to come. He's going to have to deal with a popular backlash. And the president here has some degree of domestic restraints, but not to the same degree that the President Rouhani does, because that's the number one issue in Iran. The president has all other priorities, domestic and foreign. So, you know, I do think that as these negotiations move forward, we're actually in not as bad a position as we seem to put ourselves in. Iranians need to deal more than we do, and I think we should convince ourselves of that. And they have to make more of a compromise. It's given the disparity of power between the two sides. We have intact alliances, growing economy, and they have, you know, none of the above. So this is not a negotiations between equals. This is not the United States and Soviet Union, two countries that had the power to destroy each other and the civilization many times over. We're negotiating with a second-rate power operating an embryonic nuclear program with a population that detests the regime and the region that distrusts us. We ought to be able to get a deal.
John, on that, I want to pick up on what Ray just said, and Dennis said earlier. I mean, it seems like, based on what Ray said, that we should convey a lot of leverage. And if talks go on, as Ray suggested, we should pass new sanctions. The problem is that the administration hasn't seemed to take that view. They almost, it seems like sometimes that that we look like we want to deal more than they want to deal, and we've actually squandered opportunities to enhance our leverage by, like, the veto threat earlier this year on new sanctions. And it's similar to what Dennis was saying to me on Iran, what was saying on Iran about, you know, this is, the Iranians have big problems in Iraq, what's going on today. But I wonder also that administration seems always very concerned that we don't antagonize the Iranians as opposed to enhancing our leverage. I'm just curious how you see all this. Maybe I'm wrong.
I mean, I don't necessarily disagree. On the other hand, I think the administration has, at least in the nuclear negotiation, tried at times to make efforts to suggest, particularly out of Treasury and David Cohen, actually increasing sanctions and designations with regard to violations of the sanctions regime, and traveling around the world and telling people that in fact Iran is not open for business. So I think the administration has been somewhat sensitive to that problem and has taken steps that in theory you could say might have antagonized the Iranians. I think in a number of other much more important places in the world, in places like Syria, hopefully it won't be the case in Iraq, I think you do see the administration, perhaps not for reasons of offending Iran, but for entirely its own reasons and its own foreign policy doctrine, taking steps which actually, I would think, embolden Iran and make Iran believe, in fact, that the United States is, in fact, a receiving and retrenching power in the region, and giving them more scope for maneuver, which has built up a very negative dynamic in the rest of the region that seems to me is entirely counterproductive. I would fully endorse any of the steps that Dennis suggests, very tough actions we ought to take in Syria, or to embargo illicit Iranian oil arms exports around the region. But I, at this moment, have absolutely zero faith that any of that will ever transpire or happen. So we've got that problem. In the nuclear negotiations, I agree with you entirely on the method that the administration chose to beat back the push for sanctions last fall in the face of the JPA. I thought it was just destructive from a whole series of standpoints that would pull out the warmonger card, and it doesn't portend good things going forward, I don't think, in terms of the kind of cooperation we can expect between the administration and Congress. I hope I'm wrong on that. But just back on I hope Ray's right. I have a sense that the Iranians haven't done too badly on this JPA, that they don't feel all that bad. I guess the worst outcomes that people may have predicted about the loosening of sanctions at the margins haven't come to pass, that we haven't seen the Iranian economy in any kind of dramatic revival. But my impression is that when you just look at where the economy was in terms of negative growth and continuing negative growth and a deepening crisis in the Iranian economy, that I don't know how many months away it was from a genuine crisis in the currency and inflation and unemployment, and that might have triggered precisely the kinds of popular backlash that Ray suggests. I think all that's over. Those days are gone. Maybe we can revive them. But I think a floor has now been put under the Iranian economy. It's stabilized. It's predicted now to have very, very moderate growth going forward. But I think at a macro level, there are some hopeful signs for the Iranians, and that dynamic of them feeling under that enormous pressure to come to the table and try and find relief has been dramatically reduced, I would say, over the last 6 months. On the nuclear front, I think the administration is probably right that we've hit the pause button, but there are things that the Iranians have been able to do during this pause. There's a very good study out by the Bipartisan Policy Center that Iran has quite effectively used this time to increase the productivity of its existing IR-1 centrifuges. They've become more efficient, and if those more efficient IR-1s are even used to replace the existing and installed and operating IR-1s in Iran, that it would actually accelerate Iran's ability to move towards a critical mass of enriched uranium. So Iran has used this time, it seems to me, reasonably well to test this agreement. I think it's now under less pressure than it was before to cut a deal. It can, unless the administration does some of the things that people have suggested, that at the same time it's negotiating, it's fighting with the Iranians in Syria, it's fighting against them, pushing back against them in places like Iraq. It's talking to the Israelis vigorously about transfer of enhanced military capabilities, as Mike Makovsky has written about, and it's actively planning with Congress right now what we will do on sanctions if, in fact, we extend past this 6 months.
I just want to say something sort of affirming John said, and I don't want to relitigate the JPA, but as John suggested, in 2013, the Iranian economy cradled. The decline rate was about 7%, negative 7% growth, not growth. And now it's projected to grow about 1.2. So there's been a huge turnaround. Now, I don't think JPA was responsible for all that. But at that time, the Iranian economy had cradled. The Rouhani Zarif team needed a win coming out of the gate. The terms of JPA could have been more strenuous. I think we could have probably walked away with a better deal. As I'm not relitigating it because it's an interim agreement. It's an interim agreement that's stressed today because the disagreements between the two sides. But in 2013, boy, they were cradling.
There is, I basically agree with what you just said, John. No, Ray. But there were all sorts of dire predictions about what was going to happen, about how the psychology of the market was going to take over, the sanction regime was going to collapse. Well, that didn't happen. So we should be, some of the predictions that are made that are more extreme, one has to take that into account. I do agree, obviously, that I think we do have leverage. I think that there are things that we could be doing that would enhance that leverage, and I think we should do that. I said at the time about the JPA that it was neither an abject surrender nor was it a great breakthrough. It did basically do a pause. Where the Iranian program would be right now if there wasn't an agreement, you also have to take into account. You have to weigh what additional pressure they would have been under, and you also have to weigh what more they would have been doing and whether or not, in fact, we might have seen military action have been taken by this point. And you have to think about the consequences of that. So there's this is not a black and white situation, and to try to present it as such also wouldn't be right.
Let me ask one question about the sanctions. Ray, you brought it up, and saying, if there's no deal by July 20th, the administration should work closely with Congress, and that doesn't hurt on new sanctions, if there's no deal. But one question I have about sanctions, on the one hand, they obviously had a lot of impact on the economy, but so far they haven't really stopped Iran's nuclear program. I just wonder whether even new sanctions, unless they're really severe, like a virtual economic boycott, would it divert attention from some of the other issues that Dennis and John have raised about augmenting the military option?
No, I don't. I mean, there are.
Not that that should, but it could.
Sure. There are a couple of things happening. This is a region that continuously divides against itself, and today those divisions are predicated on kind of sectarian identities, which makes them probably more durable. And it started in Syria, which became kind of a touchstone of all this, and now Iraq. So there's a competition for power in the region between Iran and various Shia groups, and the Saudis and the Sunni bloc and so on. We have sort of been not involved in this particular conflict and not particularly involved in this contest. And the things that you're talking about is about actually taking sides, is buttressing your allies, their capabilities, and so forth. And I have no problem with that. I think those things have to continue, because that's what the Iranians are doing every day. I mean, they have segregated the nuclear issue from the larger attempt to assert their influence in the region, and we should essentially push back on that, while at the same time continue negotiations. I do think that if the administration's thesis and the 5+1 thesis was that sanctions gives us leverage in negotiations, if we don't have a deal by July 20th, that statement is obviously not true. In a sense, we haven't mobilized sufficient leverage. So they should go back to Congress and try to work out something that they can live with. I do think they do have a case that they cannot look at the totality of Menendez curve. But one of the reasons why they got that bill is because they didn't engage in the negotiations with them. So if they sit on the table and say, I want this, I don't want that, this, I can be this, I want the horse trade, and that bill comes about, I think it helps them going into the negotiations with the notion that the bill has been voted on a bipartisan basis to be implemented on January 15th.
Eric, as laudable as new sanctions might be, but do you think that in Washington in the last few years, too much attention has been focused in town on sanctions at the exclusion of some of these other elements of building up our leverage, like building up the credible military option in the United States or Israel or other allies?
No, I don't think so, but I think you obviously need both. I mean, I think sanctions have been a huge part of what's gotten us this far. I mean, I think all of us here believe that a negotiated outcome is the best solution to this problem. But absent leverage, you're not going to get it. I agree with Ray that we're in a much stronger position, and we ought to take advantage of that. But one of those advantages is our ability to both impose and orchestrate more broadly these kinds of painful economic sanctions. That being said, I think in previous panel discussions, I think we've touched on this. I do think our diplomacy has been, to some degree, undercut by the perception in Tehran that although the administration says all options are on the table, they really, in fact, are not. And so I think steps that can rectify that by putting more emphasis on the potential military applications of force to solve this problem, if no diplomatic solution is available, would only strengthen the hand of the negotiators.
Eric, let me
Can I just follow up?
Sure, thanks, Chair.
Mike might not have meant this, but we have military capability. We have a military option, and we have it in the region. So the issue, and this gets back to just what Eric was saying, it's not a case of whether we have the capability, including in the region. It is a case of, do we show the same readiness to talk and compete? That's what the Iranians are doing. They're talking and competing. And we would reassure our friends in the area if we show that we will compete in the region. What's going on in the area now requires it increasingly. You don't want your response to Iraq to deepen the impression that we're prepared to make Iran our partner in the region. That's one of the reasons you have to be very careful how you approach what you're doing right now. And the fact that there is a certain converging interest with regard to ISIS is one thing, but it is a reminder that how we respond to this threat needs to take into account the other problems in the region, and in a way that doesn't leave us looking like somehow the alignment that we're going to end up with is one with the Iranians. I don't think, by the way, that's not what the administration's approach is. I don't think that's what they have in mind. But I think the more that they can do to demonstrate the readiness to compete in places like Syria to affect the balance of power on the ground. Again, you don't want to set yourself up in a situation where your only choices are either you put boots on the ground or you do nothing. That certainly is not our choice within Iraq today, and that's also not our choice in Syria today.
Mike, if I could just, I absolutely agree with what Dennis was saying about demonstrating the will to compete. And it goes back to Ray's earlier comments, implicit what John said. There is a struggle for mastery in the region going on, and Iran is competing. Everybody in the region sees Iran as making a bid for an agenda. And that competition is going on at multiple levels. The nuclear program is one part of it, but there's a competition over internal security. There's a competition over the protection of infrastructure, to the cyber attack on Takeyh. And there is a competition about that is going to be long-term and is going to be increasingly affected by a lot of the things we see going on in Asia, which is to say the deployment of anti-access area denial capabilities for the geography of the Gulf. And we have to, I think, show that we're prepared to not only compete but help our defeats all of those.
John, and it'll be the last question. We'll take questions from the audience. John, I had a question, and I just wanted to highlight something we didn't bring up yet in these talks that we've talked about in the task force, and that's the sunset clause. That's something that our task force has talked about a lot, and we don't feel it's gotten enough media attention or that people understand it. We address it in the report we put out last month. I just thought maybe you would just explain that issue and what you think some of the issues are related.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to take a stab at it, but Ray is really, I would, all due credit to Ray, who very early on recognized that even outside of the question of granting a right to enrich, the sunset clause was the real prize for the Iranians that the Iranians have been seeking. That is, at some defined point in time, whatever comprehensive deal we're now negotiating in Geneva, whatever restraints and constraints it puts on Iran, those will come to an end. Iranians want a few years, we want 20 years, whether it's 10 or 12. At some point in time, Iran knows if it behaves minimally well and doesn't push too hard in a way that would force any administration's hand to call a violation and perhaps have to make that difficult choice of actually enforcing a deal, perhaps with military force. Iran is going to be free of all these constraints and able to become an industrial-sized nuclear power on the order of America's best allies in Japan and Germany, Holland, with all of the rights that come along with that. And it seems to me that we've, any other states that we've actually stopped their nuclear program, ended their nuclear program, and granted them full access back in the international community are states that have undergone some form of regime change. We are not talking about letting Iran into this very, very elite club. Probably, although we can hope otherwise, under a regime that executes hundreds, is helping to kill tens of thousands in Syria, and looking to push America and reduce America's influence throughout the Middle East and the world. And it seems to me that that's an unprecedented situation for us to agree to allow that to happen. It's something that people do need to think very, very hard about. Does that make sense for the United States? And what can we do to mitigate the damage of the Islamic Republic of Iran being treated by the entire world after spending the better part of 2 decades cheating the world, letting them become a normal industrial strength nuclear power.
Why don't we take some questions from the audience, and we have a microphone. Jen, you want to start off with interesting looking microphone?
Thanks very much. Jennifer Rubin from the Washington Post. Going back beyond the region, I wonder if the United States has so irretrievably damaged our credibility in terms of use of force that the suggestions that you gentlemen are making will simply not impress the Iranians, whether it's Syria, where we come up to the brink and reverse ourselves, whether it's the president racing out to say that we won't use force in Iraq, whether all of that, the deadline in Afghanistan, for example, whether all of that has just left the Iranians convinced, no matter what we do now, that we won't use force. And secondly, I wonder if you could speak about our failure to link human rights in these same discussions. In the Cold War, we did that. We talked to the Russians about nuclear arms, and we dealt with human rights. And what are the consequences because we have chosen not to do that this time around?
On the use of force, I think Edelman, when he gave a speech, says he doesn't anticipate the use of force. Although I don't think that situation is irretrievable. As Dennis said, at any moment we have about 28,000 troops,
35,000.
35,000
Yes.
troops in the Gulf. The military capability of the United States are intact. Now, whether that, how the perception is that the United States is not going to use it, I think that can change. On the issue of human rights, You're quite right. I have talked about this many times. There wasn't an occasion where human rights were not brought up by Schultz with Gromyko. They weren't necessarily linked to the arms control process, but by bringing them up, the importance of human rights and how Iran treats us and the Soviet Union treated a citizen, dissident was viewed. I think a similar thing should take place. And I don't think the United States delegation should open every meeting by saying we're not after regime change in Iran. You don't have to take a position on that, affirmatively or otherwise.
I think, yes, we can, it's not too late. And, you know, I'm also a student of history. And this is not the first time the U.S. has gone through a period of appearing to retrench. It's not the first time we've been perceived within the region as retrenching. I can tell you just historically, in the Nixon administration, in the fall of 1969, after the Gaddafi coup, the White House was being inundated by all of our friends about how the region was going the other way. All of our friends were being damaged, the balance of power was shifting against them. We were doing nothing about it. I mean, it sounds very familiar. I can pick and choose in almost every decade where there are similarities. So when the U.S. demonstrates effectiveness, it turns things around. So the short answer to your question is, yes, given the capability we have, we can change the Iranian perception. And I think it is important for us to do so. The key to effective coercive diplomacy, at the end of the day, is that it's believed. And the irony, of course, is when it is believed, then diplomacy actually succeeds, and you don't have to use the force.
But I was just going to say, it does seem to me that that is the nub of the problem. I think the United States probably can correct this perception, but the perception does exist, and it does seem to me that that perception defeats, you know, achieving maximum effectiveness in your coercive diplomacy that is intended to deter bad behavior from happening, from ever happening. And it seems to me that that is the danger, that in this period in which that perception exists, as it did in 1969, you can turn it around eventually, probably at higher cost than it would have if you maintained effective coercive diplomacy from the start. And in the interval, a lot of bad things can happen, a lot of miscalculations by a lot of bad actors, and even some good actors can take place that would be contrary to American interests. And it you know, that's, it seems to me, is the danger here, that we can recover it, but it will be at a high cost, and some bad things that we otherwise could have prevented might happen in the interval.
For some reason it's red. Maybe it wants me to stop talking. But we don't. A former Democratic Secretary of State for whom I once worked and talked to recently, said, using a term of art that we use in the Pentagon, you have to have people believe that you're able to beat the crap out of somebody in order to make coercive diplomacy work. I agree with that, and so all the things that my colleagues have said about the ability to restore this, I think, an effective demonstration effect of various kinds can change perception very, very rapidly of what the United States is both capable of doing and what it's willing to do. I think even some non-kinetic things could make a big difference. It goes to Dennis's point about willingness to compete. When one thinks back to yet another historic episode, Dennis was talking about the Nixon administration, the Carter administration in the late years. In the aftermath, for instance, of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the president announced a very large plus up to the top line of the defense budget, actually the beginning of the Reagan defense build-up. And were the president just to take that one simple step in the face of sequestration and all the other things that have disabled to some degree our ability to effectively threaten coercion, I think that would have a big impact.
Thank you. I'm Rafi Danziger, an advisor to APAC. and I came late, so I apologize if this wasn't discussed before I arrived. But my question relates to the possible linkage between Iraq and the nuclear discussions. Today, an aide to Rouhani said that Iran will cooperate with the United States and Iraq only if there's a deal, a nuclear deal that Iran can accept. In other words, they are already making a linkage and trying to get American concessions on the nuclear deal in return for cooperation in Iraq. Do you think that this is something the administration might consider doing?
Rafi, you missed a brilliant discussion on this. In a nutshell, the answer, I think, is no. It should be no. What we were saying, among other things, is that they have a problem in Iraq. Yeah, we do, but they have a problem in Iraq. What I would see is there is value in deconfliction, but I would be very, very careful about looking at active cooperation.
It's always dangerous to reason by analogy, but it's hard not to look at the Balkans, which was always considered ungovernable. And then we had Marshal Tito and Yugoslavia, and at some point the world came to the conclusion that we would best off letting these small states emerge. And the one state that is failing is a result of our efforts at Dayton, Bosnia, because it has 3 presidents and multiple parliaments and so forth. The only ways that Iraq and Syria have held together have been really through dictatorships. These are people that don't naturally align with each other. And while the issues that you raised about Iran influencing a Shiite mini-state in the south are real, it's not clear to me why we would oppose the creation or emergence of these essentially ethnically identified mini-states that might cause less harm in the region and might be more amenable toward democratic change. It's really very difficult to understand why we are so committed to keeping Iraq and Syria as single entities that really were created by Sykes-Picot and the end of World War I.
Listen, if you could draw up a plan that would actually achieve this in a reasonable and rational diplomatic way. I mean, the history of changing international boundaries is not always a pleasant one. There is a huge amount of death and destruction and instability that occurs in a heart of the region that is already experiencing ample. America has too much instability, insecurity, and trouble in the heart of a region of the world that is absolutely vital to our national interests. And the fact is, we're dealt with the facts we have, which is the way that this would transpire is, in fact, with the establishment, the consolidation of an al-Qaeda rump state that has designs and plans to attack the United States here in the homeland, establishing itself in those parts of Sunni parts of Syria and Iraq, and a Shiite rump state that will almost certainly be completely beholden to Iran, our primary rival and enemy in this part of the world. Kurdistan is a completely different question that's worth its own discussion, but it just seems to me that, that managing that process that I just described would be difficult under any circumstances. Doing it in a region where the wheels are coming off everything and imagining that that would, in any kind of short to medium term, result in anything good for United States national interests, it seems to me is quite far-fetched. Now, it may happen anyway. We'll have to do the best we can and mitigate it, and people in the region will suffer a hell of a lot more than people in the United States, at least initially. But in this environment, it may be where we end up, but it doesn't seem to me that it is yet the preferred option, just because I think the consequences would be, at least initially, almost all negative for us and our friends in the region.
Sir?
I'm David Bardeen, retired, but during President Carter's administration, I served in the Energy Department, so I tend to think about oil and electricity. My question was this: I've heard a lot trying to understand the other side from President Rouhani's point of view, but very, very little of trying to understand from the supreme leader of Iran's point of view. So I ask you 2 questions. First of all, look at the de facto partition of Syria and of Iraq. Why do you all seem to think, those who have expressed an opinion, that the grand leader sees a terrible thing of ISIL, Al-Qaeda type people are the leaders of the Sunni Arab mini states. It's that control part of the oil fields there, just as the Sunni Kurdish state controls part of the oil field. I don't, what is the evidence that the Khamenei has objected to what's happened in Western Syria, or really sees a disadvantage, as long as perhaps the holy places, the Shia holy places in Iraq can be protected, and Baghdad, which I gather is now overwhelmingly Shia, as it wasn't once, but now it is. And my second question has to do with Ambassador Ross's point about reassuring the Israelis. I understand that the B-52s and the bunker buster bombs would have that effect, or tend to have that effect. But say you're the Grand Ayatollah, the supreme leader of Iran, and you are absolutely convinced that if come July 21 we don't have a deal, that President Obama will not merely commit us to talking with the Israelis, but he will publicly or secretly make a commitment that before the end of the year we transfer B-52 bombers to Israel and we transfer buster bombs. How would that influence the supreme leader of Iran?
Ray, you want to?
On the issue of whether there's advantage in kind of the sectarian division, for a long time, and in his speeches, he suggests that the Islamic Republic would like to present itself not as a patron of a sectarian group, but as kind of a Muslims writ large. So it's a sort of an Islamic state, not a sectarian state. In practice, I think, as you suggest, that they tend to be beneficiary of the rise of the Shia community. It didn't have to be that way, a Shia community that's operating outside the councils of the Sunni Arab states and also with some degree of distance from the United States. I think if you kind of go through what the Iranians suggest, they seem to think they can operate in chaotic situations, whether it's Lebanon, Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq, better than the Americans, because they just have more experience with this kind of a terrain and this kind of political topography. So there are advantages to be had as central power in these states recede, and you see the rise of sort of other kind of populations, identities, and so on, in terms of projection of power. And also the sort of a defense conception of the Iranian regime has changed really since 2008-7, that this is why General Jafari was appointed as the head of the Revolutionary Guards, because he has something called the Mosaic defense. The idea was that the United States is not going to invade a country as it did in Iraq in 2003, but it would essentially try to put pressure on it, perhaps militarily, in surgical manners, and so on. And the best way of approaching that was what he called an asymmetrical defense, and some of the capabilities are discussed. But that actually changed the role of Hezbollah and Hamas in the Iranian defense conception, because they became sort of auxiliary forces that can be used. No longer Hezbollah was a political party that Iranians hope would have greater influence in Iraq, in Lebanon, or Hamas as a greater actor in Palestinian politics. But these became actually Iran's extended deterrence. And this was Jafari's conception, to use those forces. And you begin to see that manifest itself most exclusively in Syria, and perhaps you see manifestations of that also. And maybe now they look at the Shia militias of Iraq as also part of that sort of extended deterrence, auxiliary force. And all this is supposed to provide some sort of deterrence against the United States and or its allies. And part of that asymmetrical defense is, of course, missiles, because the conventional balance of power is tilted to Iran's disadvantage. And in my opinion, nuclear weapons play a central role in this defense conception, which is why I always thought this was a nuclear weapons program. And the question for the Iranian polity is, how do you get to nuclear weapons? And I always thought the best way of doing that is in the context of a negotiated agreement, particularly one with a sunset clause. Because once you get an industrial size program, then any leakages from that are unlikely to be detected. And with the advanced centrifuges that are come online, you can essentially produce enriched uranium for weapons quality in a manner that is unlikely to be detected, I think it's make much more sense for Iran to have nuclear weapons through an agreement, because essentially an agreement will provide a shield against a military retribution and potentially imposition of sanctions which would debilitate your economy. But I digress too much, so I'll stop there.
No, look, in the near term, a regime like the Islamic Republic, under the Supreme Leader, can use the existence of these enemies to strengthen their hold internally, for sure. But it comes at a high cost. It's a near-term thing. So if ISIS establishes itself as a real bridgehead there, and they fundamentally look at the Islamic Republic and the Shia-led regime there as their most mortal enemy, that's not a great thing for the Iranians. This is going to be a constant source of expenditure, a constant ongoing conflict. So would he like to be able to have dominance in Iraq? Yes, they fought an 8.5-year war there. But the idea that they fought an 8.5-year war there and they wouldn't have an interest, of course they're going to have an interest. To have it, to maintain dominance but at a lower cost is certainly what they want. You think that they want to be losing people in Syria? No. You know, they can retain what they need in Syria with a rump state, and they clearly made it very unmistakably, you know, a fact that they have a huge stake. That's why they've invested so much in trying to keep Assad in power. But it comes at a cost to them. So it is a drain to them as time goes by. You can divide this between near term and longer term.
Thank you. Going back to the neutral question, Human Baktia with Voice of America. If there's no deal by July 20th or even by January 2015, is there a chance of this JPA, this interim deal, becoming a permanent deal?
Well, that could in theory be Iran's default position, but if it doesn't, it only works as a default position if the sanctions will actually erode. I think what Ray was getting at, I won't speak for him, he'll speak for himself. I think what Ray was getting at is the Rouhani leadership seeks to present a certain face to the outside world of being reasonable. And under those circumstances, they could try to say, look, we're reasonable, our intent is to have nuclear weapons, you know, we'll agree to the additional protocol, but we're not going to reduce our program, and hope that that creates a pressure internationally to have the sanctions erode. And that may well be, it could be the strategy for them. It only works if they can get the sanctions to erode. Now, one of the key things I think for us is to be in a position where we could have put on the table what is and what would be seen as being a reasonable proposal, where they were allowed to have civil nuclear power, but they turned it down. Because what they want, in effect, is what Ray was getting at. They want a very large program that allows them, at some point, to be able to turn it into a nuclear weapon. So I think one of the reasons I have been in favor of accepting limited enrichment, even though I accept it from the standpoint of pure non-proliferation interests, it's much better to have no enrichment. But to put us in a position where we could demonstrate that they were offered something that everyone internationally would see as a credible offer to have civil nuclear power, which included some enrichment. That would then put us in a much stronger position to expose what the real purpose would be if they're not prepared to roll back their program. You know, the negotiation gives us a chance to roll back their program in return for rolling back the sanctions. If they're not prepared to roll back their program, we have to be in a position where we can contend with what is a very different kind of regime there that is trying to present a much more reasonable face.
Maury, last question. Sorry.
How much confidence do you have that 6 months from now, the United States position in the Middle East and the world will be better off than it is now?
We elected Eric to speak on our behalf.
I've spent a lot of time in the State Department reading telegrams from around the region that testified to the fact that the situation had never been worse and couldn't get any worse. And somehow it always manages to get worse. So, you know, I don't have any confidence that we'll be in a better position 6 months from now. I mean, we could be. Things could start to turn around in Iraq. ISIS could reach the kind of natural limits of its ability to operate, start to begin to feel some of the effects of what happened earlier in 2006 and 2007 when the excesses of his predecessors' efforts led to us being able to leverage it into the surge. Who knows? But I wouldn't count on things getting better in the region, absent some very serious U.S.-led effort to change the facts on the ground in a variety of places.
Let me just add one point. Again, let's try to look at this in a context. It is not new to have non-state actors in this part of the world, although in the past, when we had non-state actors, frequently they were state actors who were the ones who basically held the keys and you had an address. Increasingly now we have non-state actors, not only without necessarily a state address to be able to create accountability, but we also have this sectarian divide. And this is going to take a very long time to play out. The kind of upheaval that we see in the region right now, this is not going to be something that's going to resolve itself in the next year or two. We're looking at what is a 10 to 20 year proposition for this to play out. And the process is going to be a very uncomfortable one for us, and we will have to think very carefully about how we position ourselves to try to not just to cope with it, but try to affect it. It is understandable not to want to get sucked into situations that promise to be high cost with very little return. But we also have to realize, again, that if the choices become always reduced to either boots on the ground or doing nothing, the option is always doing nothing, and that just adds to the scope of the problem. You know, when vacuums are created in this part of the world, they get filled by the worst possible forces. And now we have these different factors that I was just describing at play. So we need a kind of coherent, strategic response to it. It needs to obviously be well considered, but it needs to be guided by a sense that American engagement is going to be required, and how we shape that is going to be the crucible.
Just one more, since we're all seeing that. I think the story of the Middle East going forward, and probably since the Arab Spring, is erosion of state power. Whatever Middle Eastern states' shortcomings will be, the central government had command of resources, coercive power in its borders, and could control the population. That's no longer the case. And a number of these states that are sort of an amalgam of various ethnic and sectarian groups, now that's to some extent Libya, that's to some extent Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere, you begin to see these states kind of come apart, where you have non-state actors taking command of individual localities and provinces, making alliances with like-minded groups, like-minded states. And in this situation, where you have a mischievous, kind of a revisionist state like Iran, it has just a lot more to play with. You know, the only way this can turn around, and as Dennis said, it's a long-term process. It's a very heavy American commitment to rehabilitation of our allies and taking sides against our adversaries. All American administrations since the United States became involved in the Middle East have found the promise of the Middle East frustrating, intractable. I would say this is probably the first administration that has found the promise of the Middle East frustrating, intractable, but also consequential. John talked about vital interests. They think that America's vital interests are elsewhere, whether it's specific with opportunities for economic growth and some contested security issues, or elsewhere. They essentially, I think, look at the Middle East as a place where American interests are not as vital as Jones would say.
Just the final word, Mike, to fulfill my role as the far right of this panel. I would say that I think the answers that I've heard, Dennis may say, well, we need American leadership, but I think he would say he's not betting it's going to be better in 6 months is the answer to your question. I think everybody else does as well. And I just don't see the prospect in the next 6 months that the administration is going to take the kinds of steps that Dennis has. I think that all it has, or can convince itself it has, to make people begin to believe, particularly in the United States, that the situation actually is improving. And this I see as something of a danger, is in fact the Iranian nuclear deal. That's where you get an achievement, and it seems to me that there is a link with the Bergdahl event here to the extent that you begin to convince yourself within that White House bubble that you can sell something that really is, whether you agree it should happen or not, is basically a stinker that nobody should really cheer about as a great victory for American foreign policy and national security. But you then try to sell that less than successful deal as a victory, and you succumb to that temptation because you understand, at least the polls are telling you, the world is falling apart and it ain't going to be better 6 months from now.
If there's a deal and it's combined with the understanding and the need to compete, it's not that things, my point is, you're not going to expect, 6 months is the wrong measure in which to make a judgment about where things are headed, because the character of the upheaval in the region is going to go on for the next 10 to 20 years. So we need a long-term strategy, not a short or intermediate-term strategy. How we deal with Iran is part of that strategy. A deal could fit into it. It could fit into it, but it can't stand in isolation. It has to be connected to the other things that we're doing.
All right. Look, I want to thank you very much to our panelists. I thought it was a fascinating discussion. And I want to thank you all for attending. And we'll be putting out all our policy work at JINSA is done through the Gemunder Center for Defense and Strategy, and our task force on Iran. We'll be putting out more things, obviously, around after July 20th. So stay tuned, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. All right.